Jesus has revealed to Peter, this is at the end of chapter 17, revealed to Peter that children are exempt from civil and ceremonial laws in the Old Testament. So a tax collector from the temple, not from the Roman government, but from the Jewish temple, asked Peter, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax, a half shekel tax that was given for the upkeep of the temple, I think once a year or something like that. And Peter said, yeah, of course, without asking Jesus. He just said, yeah, of course. And Peter went to ask Jesus after he already answered the question from the guy. And Jesus says, do kings charge their sons a tax? And Peter said, well, no, they charge it to strangers, right? And so Jesus said, so the sons are exempt. So those who are adopted sons of God are exempt from paying the tax. And Jesus is the chief son there. He was mainly referring to himself. And then those who are co-heirs with him, adopted sons, also exempt from paying the tax, exempt from the civil and ceremonial laws. And Jesus said, but so you don't offend the guy that you already said yeah to, go fish a coin out of the sea and give it to him, So that was at the end of chapter 17. And then in chapter 18, we see that there will be stumbling blocks in the world. The children are exempt from the civil and ceremonial laws. There are stumbling blocks in the world that will cause the adopted children of God to again live like strangers. So instead of living like adopted children by grace through faith, instead they're going to live like strangers because of these stumbling blocks and go back to this legalism, go back to the civil and ceremonial laws and trying to be righteous because of those things. So stumbling blocks will be in the world. This is chapter 18, verse 7. Woe to those through whom stumbling blocks come. And then in verse 10, chapter 18, Jesus says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones. Talking there about adopted children, not only like children by age, but adopted children of God. See to it that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you, their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father. And that kind of sets us up for verses 12 through 14. So all this talk has been about stumbling blocks. And today, rather than like warning his disciples again about stumbling blocks, Jesus tells us how the Father feels about those who are adopted children. And this really is a beautiful 3 verses, very easy to grasp. Normally I'll take like 3,000 words on a page to explain one verse, and now we get 3 whole verses, and it's just a couple hundred words. So it's kind of nice. So somebody please read verses 12 through 14. All right, verse 12 here. What do you think? Jesus is asking his disciples a question, right? What do you think? He's asking this question after he tells his disciples, see to it that you don't despise any of the adopted children of God. And he says, what do you think? He's asking this question, and this is a rhetorical question, right? Because Jesus is going to answer his own question. What do you think? And he's going to get at how God feels about these adopted children. And the insinuation here is that you should feel the same way about God's adopted children that God does. What do you think? If a man, and he goes into this illustration, this illustrative sort of question, if a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go to search for the one that is straying? Any shepherd would do this. Any human shepherd would do this. Any man who owns sheep would do this. If it turns out that he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 which have not gone astray. So it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones, referring again to the adopted children of God, that any of these little ones perish. And so the couple things I want to notice here, and it really is this simple, right, is Jesus uses the life of a shepherd and the work of a shepherd to illustrate the work of God. He answers his own question, what do you think? But then he says, this is not the will of God that any of these little ones should perish, right? That any of the adopted children of God should perish.
Are they all adopted though?
Well, that's the whole thing here has been about the adopted children of God. And every time Jesus has referred to the little ones, not only in this passage, but throughout Matthew's gospel, it's been the adopted children of God and not children by age, which is really interesting. And the child that was used by age was used as an illustration to illustrate the adopted children of God. That's been the turning of the text up to this point. Matthew's just not going to change the way he's doing things. So Jesus is saying, like a shepherd goes after one sheep, so God goes after any of his children that stray. So God goes after them. He leaves the 99 who are remaining faithful, and he goes after the one who is straying. And I, just looking at these 3 verses and reading through the commentaries and seeing sermons that I've seen on this and hearing sermons growing up that I've heard on this, that's the way I've heard this passage presented every time. I can't think of a preacher who misrepresented this text. So that's it. That's the explanation. Yeah, it's interesting. Jesus here, and it's not just about the way God feels, right? It's actually about the will of the Father. And so God willfully, he's not willing that any perish. He's not willing that any who go astray perish. He's going to bring all of his sheep back into the fold, which is, I own this sheep. I'm going to get it. It's not just this. There are no acceptable losses when it comes to God doing his work and bringing his sheep in. As we reflect on this, I also want to reflect on all the little implications, right? Everything that this means concerning our theology, doctrine, the way that we live. So I think 3 questions here. Yeah, 3 questions that I want to ask. But before I do you guys have any? In my notes, I wrote that down. I said, would it be too much to say that we should then go and seek out all of the lost sheep and do everything we can to bring them in? That sounds pretty good, doesn't it?
It's easier with a sheep.
Yeah, it sounds great.
And
But
the people.
But then I look into this passage, and not to say that we shouldn't practice evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
I believe we should. I think we should be missional people with our lives and with what we do in the church. But in this text, it's pretty specifically the Father's the one who doesn't will that any should perish, and Jesus is the one bringing the sheep back in. So I think it is taking this text too far, or drawing the application too far, to say, okay, well, this text applies to me in this way then, because it's Jesus who's doing that work. Now, I think we should be doing evangelism. I don't think we should be, because here's one of the dangers too, I don't think we should just be breaking our backs, right, to make sure we go and get everybody we can and bring them into church, right? So that could be one of the ways that would even be misapplied, right?
Like the gospel of compulsion.
Gospel of compulsion, or the seeker-sensitive sort of movement, or even guilting people into, did you go to church today? Guilting people into it. And I've seen that done. I see that done in our own community, but it's not a healthy application. So I really wanted to go that way with the text. So I read the text and I was like, oh, possible application. And then as I studied the text, I was like, I can't get there from this text. So it's, yeah.
A bit of a stretch.
Yeah, it is a bit of a stretch from this text. Now you can go to Matthew 28 and say, oh, go make disciples of all nations. Okay, yes, we should do evangelism and missions. No, we can't get there from this text, right? So, yeah, it's all very interesting. I wasn't even going to mention that, but then you did. So I was like, well, let me just share my whole journey through this passage. Yeah. Anything else before I ask a couple of the questions that I have? I say a couple of the questions that I have. I only have a couple questions. So who are the lost sheep? Seems like a simple question up front, but there are 3 possibilities. The lost sheep Jesus is referring to here could either be the Jews, they could be the elect who have not yet experienced conversion, or they could be those who have been converted but have stumbled. And we can arrive at any of those conclusions looking at context. So Who are the lost sheep? Who is Jesus talking about here? Let me throw this at you guys. In Matthew 15:24, which came before this, Jesus made the statement, I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So let me throw that statement at you for your consideration. In that text, we did get a taste of some form of Gentile inclusion with Israel. And the lost sheep, according to Matthew, are at least some Jews, and come to include some of the Gentiles. We see that John chapter 10, verse 16 as well, that the lost sheep come to include some of the Gentiles. And in the immediate context, stumbling blocks are in view. And so, yeah, in the context of Matthew's gospel, like all three of these things are represented. So the lost sheep in view here, it's really difficult to like pinpoint who the lost sheep are, because Matthew, he's referred to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and in that passage we saw there's some form of Gentile inclusion, which is the Samaritan, a half-breed, not really a Jew, not a true Jew, right, biologically speaking. And then also here we have the stumbling blocks mentioned. So in view here could be any number of things, or all of the above: Jews and Gentiles and people who stumble and fall away and start, instead of living like adopted children, start living like strangers again. Could be any of those things or all of those things. So I'm so glad I could clear that up for us. And so I'm going through this, trying to answer this question. Well, who are the lost sheep in view? And it seems to be just a very general statement that's being made. Very general, referring to elect people who in some way are either they haven't become faithful to the Lord yet, to the Father yet, or they did become faithful, made a confession of faith, experienced conversion, and then somehow fell away. It could be all of those things in view here. And Jesus, I think he's being a little vague on purpose. And so I want to, not all people are lost sheep. 100% of Christ's sheep is not 100% of everybody in the world, right? So you have this almost like you have all the people in the world, and then you have the sheep of Christ. Are all Jews, in the context of Matthew's gospel, and we'll answer this question first, and then we'll think about it with Gentiles in view, right? Are all Jews the lost sheep of Israel, or is it more like a remnant? If it's Jesus' goal to save all the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and he's talking to some Pharisees in Matthew chapter 12, right? He's talking to some Pharisees, and he says, you sons of snakes, you sons of serpents, by your words you are condemned. Well, condemned is not saved. If Jesus is here to save all the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and those Pharisees and scribes apparently aren't lost sheep because Jesus is condemning them rather than saving them, right? Then not all of Israel is part of this lost sheep. It's a remnant Jesus is dealing with here. And you look through it, you do a biblical theology, which is really cool. I just started getting into biblical theology at the end of last year, which is really kind of cool, because I really needed to study for a paper that I'm writing. It's a monster of a paper. But biblical theology, you look at theology of sonship, of remnants, covenant theology through the Old Testament. And it's God starts with the whole nation of Israel, and then there are reprobate people, and then reprobate tribes. A couple of the tribes were reprobate tribes, right? And then you have the division of the northern and southern kingdom, and God says, okay, I'm only going to deal now with Judah and Benjamin, and the rest of the tribes are lost. And then within Judah and Benjamin, it just basically becomes the line of David, and God's always working through this. He's always choosing a smaller and smaller remnant until you have Jesus Christ the Messiah, who is basically he's the remnant now, and now faith has to be in him. And it's really cool to see that. So you see this Old Testament typology playing out in now the people of God. Not all Israel is Israel. Have you heard that? That is in, let's see here. Let's see if I wrote it down, because I don't remember the reference. This is how put together Romans chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. The Apostle Paul writes, not all Israel is Israel. It's always about a remnant. Always about a remnant. And I think Jesus is getting at that here. How does that apply to Gentiles? Because Gentiles are at least partially in view here, because they're partially in view in Matthew's Gospel. Now, Matthew's Gospel is written primarily to Jews, right? So that's the big emphasis. But Gentiles are partially in view here. How does that apply to Gentiles? Yeah, there's the engrafting of Gentiles, which means not every Gentile is one of the lost sheep, but there's also a remnant within the Gentile nations that God is calling to himself, and that would be the lost sheep among the Gentiles. So we have like election in view, right? God has elected a people for himself from among the nations, Jew and Gentile alike, and he is bringing his sheep into his fold. And if any of his sheep go astray, he chases them down and brings them back in. This really is a beautiful picture of God's love, his care over his flock, his watch care over his flock. Just like a shepherd keeps watch care over his flock. This is this illustration. It's a beautiful thing. How does the Father feel about the return of a lost sheep?
Rejoices.
He rejoices.
He's happy for it.
Yeah. And so this text doesn't tell us that God rejoices over one person that experiences conversion or is brought back in. But it does say that the will of the Father is like this shepherd in the illustration. If it turns out that he, the shepherd, finds his sheep, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 which have not gone astray. And the Father's will is like this shepherd in this illustration. And Jesus is telling us this. The Father's will is like this. He takes great pleasure when a wayward sheep returns to the fold, when somebody experiences conversion. So that means when a Jew, experiences conversion to Christ, or when a Gentile experiences conversion to Christ, or if somebody was part of the covenant community straight away and is brought back into the fold. The Father rejoices about that. And this is something really cool to think about, because we tend to think, those apostates, those darn people, and they come back in, and we're a little skeptical of them, or we know somebody's history, and it's like, I don't know about you, right? But we just think about even the Apostle Paul, when God took him down on the road to Damascus and blinded him, and Jesus, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul experienced conversion there and went into Damascus. And Ananias didn't want to go see him. Ananias didn't want to go see him, but God said, Ananias, you need to go see Paul. Go see Saul. And Saul, after that, he goes to see the apostles, and he knocks on the church door. And he's like, no, don't let him in here. We know what he did. But then Barnabas, wasn't it, let him in. Mm-hmm. And Barnabas let him in the doors, and the church rejoiced. It's like God rejoices over that. No matter how terrible a person is, if they're chosen by God, God rejoices when they come into the fold. He rejoices more over that than over us, sitting here being faithful. And that's not to say God doesn't rejoice in our being faithful, but he rejoices more when one of the lost sheep return. And that's really cool to think about. I almost want to go wayward just so I can return and be rejoiced over more. No, I don't.
Then you want to know what Paul is talking about. Should I sin just because?
Just because. No, by no means. Yeah.
How is this the same or different than the prodigal son?
It's almost the same as a prodigal son situation. Okay. Yeah. It's really cool. Does the father succeed in bringing his sheep back into the fold every time? This text doesn't tell us. Now notice the sheep do not seek the father, and the father wills to seek after the sheep. It's about the father's desire, the father's will. He does so in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus came to seek and save that which was lost. If Jesus does not accomplish what he purposed to accomplish, then he failed and was wrong about what he would accomplish. So Jesus says, I came to seek and save the lost. Jesus said that. I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And Jesus said that. If Jesus doesn't accomplish that, then Jesus failed. What problem would there be if, for us as Christians, people who worship Jesus Christ, if Jesus Christ failed at fulfilling the purpose that he set out to accomplish by coming to earth? That'd be a pretty bad place, wouldn't it? Now, Jesus says, I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I came to seek and save that which was lost.
Right.
And he doesn't accomplish that. He doesn't save all of the lost sheep. Then that's failure on Jesus' part. That's why it's good that this is a remnant and not the whole of society, right? Because obviously the whole of society is not being saved. And people do choose not to accept Jesus. C.S. Lewis posed an interesting question, right? Jesus says, I came to seek and save that which was lost. I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I will accomplish this. This is what I came to do. I will not fail. C.S. Lewis posed a trilemma. Jesus is either a liar or a lunatic or Lord. That's right. So either Jesus was lying about his purpose, and he really didn't come to save all the lost sheep, just some of them, right? Or he's a lunatic. He's crazy, thinking that he could save all of the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Or he's actually Lord, and he actually got that done. Those are the three options here. To think that Jesus failed undermines the entire Christian faith. To think that Jesus didn't save every single one of those for whom he died, or doesn't save every single one of those for whom he died, to say that he doesn't do that, that undermines the entire Christian faith, undermines the entire Christian worldview, it undermines the gospel. Jesus, in that case, is either a liar or a lunatic, and he's not Lord. Which means, if we don't believe that Jesus saves all those for whom he died, there's no point in his being here. Now that led some theologians to adopt a weird form of universalism, right? After Origen in the Catholic Church. And then many Christians kind of try and go that way today too. Like, oh, well, that means eventually everybody will be saved because Jesus died for everybody. But not everybody comes to faith, right? Right. So you have this what we call in the Reformed Church there's unconditional election, and Jesus doesn't depend on what you do to save you, right? But then there's also this called it limited atonement, and it's not limited as if Jesus is limited. It's limited as in its extent. Jesus didn't die to cover the sins of everyone, to atone for everyone, but he did die to atone for all of the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then in this text we read, it is not the Father's will. Here reading about the Father's will. So this isn't just about God, the way he feels. This is about what he has willed to do. This is about what he has set forth to do. It is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. And then Jesus teaches that no one the Father has given him will be lost, not a single one. We see that in John chapter 6, verse 39, and John chapter 10, verse 28. Jesus will convert all the lost sheep, and he will bring those who have stumbled back into his flock, which is the visible church, the covenant community. This really is sort of a just really beautiful doctrine. We have here in view irresistible grace, if you've heard that term before. If you hear the term irresistible grace, what do you think of? It seems to me people resist God's grace all the time. Doesn't it? It's actually a very strong doctrine in Scripture, but I think it gets misdefined, and people hear the word irresistible grace and they start thinking some weird stuff because they don't really know what it is. Irresistible grace is it's not a term, it's a theological term that means Christ will save everyone by grace that the Father gives to him. That's what irresistible grace means, right? Irresistible grace does not mean that people don't resist God. Right, because people resist God all the time. That's our nature. Irresistible grace does not mean that Christians won't stumble and resist God's grace for a time. Irresistible grace means that if God has chosen you, He will win you. Finally, even if you reject a gospel invitation at first, God knows how to direct the circumstances of your life. God knows how to work all things together. If God has chosen you, He will bring you into His fold. And here's the cool thing about the word irresistible in that, is that God works it out to where He has actually turned our hearts to choose Him. And so it's not like, okay, I'm forcing you sheep to come into my fold. It's God actually, His grace is irresistible in that way. So that those who are objects of His particular grace, He brings them in a very loving way, it's just a beautiful picture, a beautiful doctrine. What a comfort it is to know that, especially like in regard to evangelism, when we fail, God is winning His people anyway. It's not His will that a single one should be lost, a single one should perish, right? God is winning His people anyway. So when we fail at evangelism, this is a great comfort. This doctrine is a great comfort. This doctrine is a great comfort when we have family members, children, grandchildren who are apostate, or friends who left the church. It's like, well, if God has really chosen them, He'll bring them back, and He promises to do that. It is not His will that any of them perish. So I take great comfort in these words and passages of Scripture like this, and in that doctrine of irresistible grace, because it means what it says. Christ will not lose any of those the Father has given Him. It is not the Father's will that any of His adopted children perish. That's where we land. Simple passage, simple explanation. Man, is it a deep encouragement. It really is a deep encouragement here.